church bells of Hollow Creek, Montana rang out on that bitter December morning of 1885. But they might as well have been funeral bells for Clara Whitmore. As she stepped through those heavy oak doors in her yellowed wedding dress, the only fine thing she owned, the congregation's whispers, hit her like a winter wind. "Look at the size of her," they hissed. "Disgraceful." But what happened next would change everything, because sometimes the cruelest moments lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Stay with me until the end of this story, and please comment with your city so I can see how far this tale of unexpected love has traveled. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered ground as Clara Whitmore stood before the cracked mirror in her tiny cabin, her trembling fingers working to fasten the pearl buttons of her wedding dress. The ivory silk, now yellowed with age and stretched beyond its original design, was all she had left of her former life. Today marked 1 year since her husband Thomas had been laid to rest, and tradition demanded she honor his memory at Sunday service. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection, though the woman staring back seemed like a stranger. The face was rounder now, the body beneath the dress fuller than it had been on her wedding day 5 years prior. Grief had a way of changing people, and Clara had found solace in the simple act of baking bread, of making preserves, of filling the endless empty hours with the comfort of food. The walk to Hollow Creek's only church felt like a death march. Each step through the snow-packed streets drew stares from the townspeople, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and judgment. Clara kept her chin raised, her late mother's voice echoing in her memory. "A lady never lets them see her break, Clarabelle." The church stood like a fortress against the Montana sky, its white-painted boards stark against the winter landscape. As Clara approached the heavy oak doors, she could hear the murmur of voices within the rustle of Sunday clothes, the soft cough of old Mrs. Henderson, who sat in the third pew every week without fail. She paused at the threshold, her gloved hand resting on the cold iron handle. Through the glass panels, she could see the familiar faces of Hollow Creek's finest citizens. There was Judge Morrison with his silver mustache, Mayor Crawley adjusting his spectacles, and in the front row, the Pemberton family, the town's wealthiest residents who owned the general store and half the buildings on Main Street. Taking a deep breath that misted in the cold air, Clara pushed open the doors. The effect was immediate and devastating. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison as if choreographed. The whispers began as a low hum and quickly rose to an unmistakable buzz of gossip and disapproval. "Well, I never," gasped Mrs. Pemberton, her voice carrying clearly across the sanctuary. "Is that Clara Whitmore in her wedding dress?" "Poor dear's lost her mind along with her figure," added Mrs. Caldwell, not bothering to lower her voice. Clara's face burned with shame, but she forced herself to walk down the center aisle toward an empty pew near the back. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, her legs heavy with humiliation. The wedding dress, which had once made her feel like a princess, now felt like a costume in a cruel theater production. "She's gotten so fat," whispered Sarah Pemberton to her sister. "How does she even fit in that dress?" "Shameful," muttered old Mr. Hendricks. Thomas Whitmore's rolling in his grave. As Clara slid into the wooden pew, the whispers grew louder, more vicious. She tried to focus on Pastor Williams as he took his place at the pulpit, but the cruel comments surrounded her like a swarm of angry bees. "Look at how that dress strains at the seams. She's twice the size she was when Thomas married her. No wonder she lives alone. Who'd want that?" Pastor Williams cleared his throat and called for quiet, but the damage was done. Clara's hands shook as she opened her hymnal, trying desperately to appear unaffected by the cruelty around her. When the congregation rose to sing Amazing Grace, she found she couldn't make a sound past the lump in her throat. The sermon blurred together Pastor Williams' words about forgiveness and compassion falling on deaf ears in a sanctuary filled with judgment. Clara stared at her lap, at the worn fabric of her gloves, at anything except the faces around her that radiated disapproval. It was during the final prayer that she heard Judge Morrison's wife lean over to whisper, "Someone should tell her that dress makes her look like a stuffed sausage." The laughter that followed was quickly stifled, but not quickly enough. Clara's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she grabbed her small purse and pushed past the other congregants toward the door. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Pemberton's theatrical whisper, "Well, that's what happens when a woman lets herself go completely." The cold air hit her face like a slap as she burst through the church doors, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. Snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes, dusting her shoulders and catching in her hair. She stumbled down the church steps, her vision blurred with tears, her heart pounding with humiliation. "Clara, Clara, wait!" She turned to see Pastor Williams hurrying after her, his black coat flapping in the wind. "I'm so sorry," he said, reaching for her arm. "They had no right to speak to you that way." "But they did," Clara choked out. "They all think it. I can see it in their eyes every time I come to town. That's not true. You're a good woman who's been through a terrible loss. Thomas loved you." "Thomas loved who I used to be." Clara interrupted, her voice breaking. "Not this. Not what I've become." She pulled away from the pastor's gentle grip and hurried down Main Street, desperate to escape the prying eyes that seemed to follow her from every window. The snow was falling harder now, creating a white curtain that should have provided some privacy, but Clara felt as exposed as if she were standing naked in the town square. Her small cabin sat at the edge of town, a modest structure that Thomas had built with his own hands when they'd first married. It had been filled with such hope then, such dreams of the children they would raise and the life they would build together. Now, it felt like a tomb housing only memories and regret. Clara fumbled with the door latch, her fingers numb with cold and emotion. Finally, inside, she collapsed against the closed door and let the tears come in earnest. Great heaving sobs that shook her entire body, months of grief and loneliness and shame pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. The wedding dress suddenly felt suffocating. She clawed at the buttons, desperate to escape the silk prison that had become a symbol of her humiliation. But her shaking fingers couldn't manage the tiny pearl fastenings, and her frustration only grew. "I can't even take off my own dress," she sobbed to the empty room. "What kind of woman am I?" Outside, the wind howled around the cabin, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling past the glass. Clara sank onto her small sofa, still trapped in the wedding dress, and stared at the cold fireplace. She didn't have the energy to build a fire, didn't have the will to care about staying warm. For the first time since Thomas's death, she found herself wondering if there was any point in going on. The town would never accept her, never see past her weight to the woman she was inside. She was 28 years old and already considered a hopeless spinster, too fat and too broken to ever find love again. The sound of horses' hooves outside broke through her despair. Clara wiped her eyes and peered through the frost-covered window, expecting to see someone passing by on their way out of town. Instead, she saw a man dismounting from a large black horse, his movements careful and deliberate in the snow. He was tall and lean, dressed in a heavy coat and worn boots that spoke of a working man rather than a town dandy. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but Clara could see the strong line of his jaw, the confident way he carried himself. He tied his horse to the post near her front gate and stood for a moment looking at her cabin as if debating something. Clara's heart hammered in her chest. She didn't receive visitors, hadn't since the first few weeks after Thomas's funeral, when the church ladies had brought casseroles and unwanted advice. Who was this stranger, and what could he possibly want with her? A firm knock echoed through the small cabin. Clara remained frozen on the sofa, hoping he would simply go away. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. Mrs. Whitmore. The voice was deep, patient. I'm Ethan Dyer. I wondered if I might have a word with you. The name meant nothing to Clara, but something in his tone made her rise from the sofa and move toward the door. She paused with her hand on the latch, suddenly aware of how she must look tear-stained and rumpled in her wrinkled wedding dress. "What do you want?" she called through the door. "I saw what happened at church today," he said. "I thought you might need someone to talk to." Clara's cheeks burned with fresh shame. Of course he'd witnessed her humiliation. Everyone in town had. "I'm fine," she lied. "Thank you for your concern, but—" "No, ma'am, you're not fine," he interrupted gently. "And neither would I be, if a bunch of small-minded folks had treated me the way they treated you." His honesty caught her off guard. Most people would have politely pretended nothing had happened, would have offered empty platitudes about Christian forgiveness. This stranger was acknowledging the cruelty she'd endured. Slowly, Clara opened the door. The man standing on her porch was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with weathered hands and kind blue eyes that reminded her of summer skies. His dark hair curled slightly beneath his hat, and there was something solid and reassuring about his presence. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I couldn't let what happened at church stand without saying something." "You don't need to pretend it wasn't as bad as it seemed," Clara said, her voice hollow. "I know what I looked like in there." "You looked like a woman honoring her husband's memory the best way she knew how," Ethan replied firmly. "Anyone with eyes could see that dress meant something to you." Clara's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. When was the last time someone had spoken to her with such simple kindness? "Thank you," she whispered. "But you don't have to." "Ma'am, I run a ranch about 10 miles outside of town," Ethan continued. "Hollow Ridge. It's just me and my daughter out there, and we could use some help. Someone to keep house, maybe help with cooking and such. The work's honest, and I pay fair wages." Clara stared at him in shock. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance," he said, "if you want it." "I don't understand. You don't even know me." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "I know you're brave enough to walk into that church with your head held high, even when you knew what you'd face. I know you loved your husband enough to honor him, even when it cost you. And I know you're strong enough to start over, if you want to. The people in town don't live at my ranch," Ethan finished. "It's just me and Eliza out there. She's 6 years old and could use a woman's influence. Her mother died when she was born." Clara's heart ached at the thought of a motherless child. "Mr. Dyer, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for the job. I'm not exactly... I don't look like most women you'd want around your daughter." Ethan's expression darkened slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore, with all due respect, if you think a child's going to judge you by your size, then you don't know much about children. Eliza needs someone kind and patient. From what I saw today, you're both of those things. How could you possibly know that from watching me run out of church?" "Because you didn't stay to defend yourself or argue back," he said simply. "You took the high road even when it hurt. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Snow continued to fall around them, dusting Ethan's shoulders and gathering on the brim of his hat. Clara realized she'd been keeping him standing in the cold, and despite her confusion and fear, her mother's lessons in hospitality kicked in. "Would you like to come in? You must be freezing." Ethan shook his head. "I don't want to impose. I just wanted to make the offer and let you think about it." "I don't even know you," Clara said, though something in her chest had begun to flutter with possibility. "No, ma'am, you don't. But you're welcome to come out to the ranch and meet Eliza, see the place for yourself. No obligation. If you decide it's not for you, I'll bring you back to town, no questions asked." Clara looked back into her empty cabin, then at this stranger who was offering her something she'd thought impossible, a fresh start. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you want to help me?" Ethan was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "Because everyone deserves a chance to start over. And because I have a feeling that little girl in there needs you as much as you need her." The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them, like nature's own blessing. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and made a decision that would change everything. "When?" she asked. "Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow, if you like." Clara nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, then. But just to see the place." Ethan's smile was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Just to see the place," he agreed. As he mounted his horse and rode away into the falling snow, Clara stood in her doorway watching until he disappeared from view. For the first time in months, she felt something stir in her chest that might have been hope. She closed the door and looked around her cabin at the cold fireplace, the empty rooms, the silence that had become her constant companion. Tomorrow she would see what lay beyond the borders of her grief. Tomorrow, she would take the first step toward discovering that sometimes the worst day of your life could be the beginning of your best one. The morning came with a crystalline clarity that made the snow sparkle like diamonds scattered across the Montana landscape. Clara had barely slept, her mind churning between hope and terror as she prepared for the journey to Hollow Ridge Ranch. She'd packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag, though she kept telling herself this was merely a visit, nothing more. At precisely 9 o'clock, the sound of approaching horses broke the morning stillness. Clara peered through her window to see Ethan Dyer driving a sturdy wagon, its wooden sides weathered but well-maintained. Beside him sat a small figure bundled in a thick wool coat, his daughter, she realized, her heart giving an unexpected flutter. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ethan called softly as he approached her door. "We're here when you're ready." Clara took one last look around her cabin at the life she was potentially leaving behind. The cold ashes in the fireplace, the empty shelves, the silence that had become both comfort and torment. With a deep breath that misted in the cold air, she gathered her carpet bag and stepped outside. The little girl in the wagon turned to stare at Clara with wide, curious eyes. She had her father's blue gaze, but softer features framed by honey-colored braids that peeked out from beneath her knitted cap. There was something achingly vulnerable about her small face, a wariness that spoke of too much loss for such a young soul. "Eliza," Ethan said gently, "this is Mrs. Whitmore, the lady I told you about." The child regarded Clara solemnly for a long moment before offering a tiny wave. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the winter wind. "Hello, sweetheart," Clara replied, her heart immediately drawn to this motherless child. "What a pretty name you have." A ghost of a smile flickered across Eliza's face before she ducked her head shyly. Ethan climbed down from the wagon to help Clara with her bag, his movements efficient but gentle. "It's about an hour's ride," he explained as he secured her belongings in the wagon bed. "The road can be rough this time of year, but the horses know the way." As they pulled away from Clara's cabin, she found herself looking back one final time. The small structure seemed to shrink against the vast Montana sky, becoming just another speck in the endless white landscape. There was something both terrifying and liberating about watching her old life disappear behind them. "Papa says you might come live with us," Eliza said suddenly, her small voice breaking the comfortable silence. She turned in her seat to study Clara with the frank curiosity that only children possessed. "Well, we'll see about that," Clara replied carefully. "I'm just coming to visit today." "Do you know how to make cookies?" Eliza asked, her eyes brightening with interest. Clara couldn't help but smile. I do indeed, all kinds. Papa tries, but they always burn on the bottom, Eliza confided, with the serious tone of someone sharing a great secret. And his biscuits are hard as rocks. Eliza, Ethan warned, though there was laughter in his voice. You're not supposed to tell people about my cooking disasters. But it's true, Papa. Remember when you tried to make that cake for my birthday and the chickens wouldn't even eat it? Clara found herself laughing, actually laughing for the first time in months. What happened to the cake? We had to bury it, Eliza said with perfect seriousness. Papa said it was too dangerous to leave lying around. It wasn't that bad, Ethan protested, but his cheeks had reddened slightly. I just miscalculated the proportions. You put salt where the sugar was supposed to go, Eliza reminded him. And then you tried to fix it by adding more sugar, but you grabbed the salt again. I think that's enough storytelling for now, little miss, Ethan said, but his tone was warm with affection. Clara could see the deep bond between father and daughter, the easy intimacy that spoke of shared jokes and mutual devotion. As they traveled deeper into the countryside, Clara felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. Away from the judgment and whispers of town, surrounded by nothing but pristine wilderness and the gentle conversation of her companions, she could almost believe she might find peace here. The landscape was breathtaking in its stark beauty. Rolling hills stretched endlessly in every direction, their snow-covered surfaces broken only by clusters of pine trees and the occasional hawk circling overhead. It was a land that demanded strength and resilience, but also offered a kind of freedom that Clara had never experienced in town. There it is, Ethan said finally, pointing ahead to where a cluster of buildings nestled in a protected valley. Hollow Ridge. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she took in her first view of what might become her new home. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected, a two-story structure built from honey-colored logs with a wide wraparound porch that seemed to beckon visitors inside. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth and comfort within. Behind the main house stood a sturdy barn, several outbuildings, and a corral where horses moved like shadows against the snow. It's beautiful, Clara breathed, meaning every word. Mama's garden is under all that snow, Eliza said, pointing to a section near the house where wooden stakes marked the boundaries of what had once been cultivated ground. Papa says when spring comes, maybe someone could plant flowers there again. The child's words hit Clara like a physical blow. She could picture it, the garden in full-bloom vegetables growing in neat rows. Perhaps a few sunflowers nodding their heavy heads in the summer breeze. It was a dream she'd once harbored for her own small cabin, before grief had stolen her ability to imagine any kind of future. As they pulled up to the house, several dogs emerged from various hiding spots to greet them with enthusiastic barking and tail wagging. A border collie mix led the pack, followed by what appeared to be a retriever and a small terrier of indeterminate breeding. Don't mind them, Ethan said as he helped Clara down from the wagon. They're friendly, just excited to see someone new. The dogs surrounded Clara with curious sniffs and gentle nudges, their warm acceptance somehow more meaningful than any human greeting she'd received in months. She knelt to pet them, surprised by how good it felt to be welcomed so unconditionally. That's Scout, Eliza said, pointing to the border collie. And that's Honey, and the little one is Biscuit. Papa let me name them. They're wonderful, Clara said, scratching behind Scout's ears as the dog leaned into her touch. How long have you had them? Scout and Honey came with the ranch when we bought it 3 years ago, Ethan explained. Biscuit showed up last winter, half-starved and looking for a home. Eliza insisted we keep him. He was crying in the snow, Eliza added solemnly. Just like I used to cry for Mama. Papa said everyone needs a family. The simple wisdom of the child's words brought tears to Clara's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, not wanting to upset Eliza with her emotion. Ethan seemed to sense her feelings. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you inside where it's warm. I'll show you around." The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace with a fire crackling merrily, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with built-in bookshelves. Comfortable furniture arranged in conversation areas spoke of evenings spent reading or sharing stories. The floors were wide plank pine polished to a warm glow and covered with colorful braided rugs. "This is lovely," Clara said, turning slowly to take it all in. "Did you build all this yourself?" "The original cabin was here when I bought the land," Ethan explained. "But I've added onto it over the years. The kitchen's through here." He led her through an arched doorway into a spacious kitchen that made Clara's heart sing. Copper pots hung from hooks above a large cast-iron stove. Open shelves displayed dishes and glassware, while a massive wooden table dominated the center of the room. Windows on two sides let in streams of natural light, and she could imagine how cheerful it would be on a sunny day. "Oh my," Clara breathed, running her fingers along the smooth surface of the work table. "This is a cook's dream." "You really think so?" Ethan asked, and she caught something almost vulnerable in his voice. "I tried to design it the way my mother would have wanted. She loved to cook." "Where is she now?" Clara asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw Ethan's expression close off slightly. "She passed when I was 20, he said quietly. "Fever took both my parents that winter. That's when I decided to head west, start fresh." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right. That was a long time ago." Ethan moved to the stove, checking the kettle that sat steaming on one of the burners. "Would you like some coffee, tea?" "Coffee would be wonderful." As Ethan busied himself with cups and saucers, Eliza tugged on Clara's skirt to get her attention. "Want to see my room?" she asked shyly. "I'd love to." The little girl led Clara up a narrow staircase to the second floor, chattering nervously as they climbed. "It's not very fancy," she warned. "Papa says when I'm bigger, I can help pick out new curtains and things." Eliza's room was small but cozy, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a small desk positioned under the window. What caught Clara's attention, however, were the drawings covering nearly every surface, childish sketches of horses and flowers, trees and clouds, and in several of them, the figure of a woman with long hair and a kind smile. "Did you draw all of these?" Clara asked, genuinely impressed by the child's artistic efforts. Eliza nodded proudly. "Papa taught me. He's really good at drawing. That one's my mama," she added, pointing to one of the sketches of the smiling woman. Clara's throat tightened with emotion. "She looks very beautiful and very kind." "She was," Eliza said simply. "I don't remember her much, but Papa tells me stories. He says she would have loved me very much." "I'm sure she would have," Clara said softly. "And I'm sure she'd be very proud of what a smart, talented little girl you've become." Eliza beamed at the praise, then grew serious again. "Do you think, if you came to live here, would you tell me stories too, about ladies and pretty dresses and things like that?" The question hit Clara like an arrow to the heart. Here was this precious child hungry for feminine companionship, for the kind of stories and lessons that only a woman could provide. And she was asking Clara, fat, broken, humiliated Clara, to fill that void. "I think I'd like that very much," Clara managed to say around the lump in her throat. They returned to the kitchen to find Ethan waiting with steaming cups of coffee and a plate of store-bought cookies that he'd clearly arranged with great care. "I know they're not homemade," he said apologetically, "but I thought Eliza might like something sweet." "They look perfect." Clara assured him, accepting a cup of coffee and warming her hands around the ceramic. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what she needed after the cold wagon ride. As they sat around the kitchen table, Clara found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. Eliza chattered happily about her drawings, her lessons with her father, and the adventures she had exploring the ranch with the dogs. Ethan listened with the patience of a man who genuinely enjoyed his daughter's company, occasionally adding details or asking questions that encouraged her to elaborate. "Papa's teaching me to read really good books," Eliza announced. "We just finished one about a girl who lived in a tower. But I think it would be more fun to live on a ranch, don't you?" "I think you're absolutely right," Clara agreed. "Towers seem very lonely." "That's what I told Papa. And you can't have dogs in a tower, or horses, or gardens." "Speaking of horses," Ethan interjected, "would you like to see the barn? We've got some gentle mares that Eliza's learning to ride." Clara hesitated. She'd never been comfortable around horses, always finding them too large and unpredictable. But something in Eliza's eager expression made her nod. "I'd like that very much." They bundled up in coats and scarves before venturing out into the cold afternoon air. The barn was warm and fragrant, with the scent of hay and leather. 6 horses occupied the stalls, their heads turning with interest as the visitors approached. "This is Buttercup," Eliza said, stopping at the first stall to pat the nose of a gentle-looking mare with a golden coat. "She's mine. Well, sort of mine. Papa says when I'm bigger, she'll be all mine." Buttercup whickered softly and nuzzled Eliza's small hand, clearly accustomed to the child's attention. Clara watched the interaction with fascination, amazed by how natural and comfortable Eliza seemed with the large animal. "She's beautiful," Clara said, meaning it. "How long have you been learning to ride?" "Since I was 4, Eliza said proudly. "Papa says I'm a natural. Want to pet her?" Clara approached cautiously, extending her hand for Buttercup to sniff. The mare's breath was warm and sweet, her dark eyes gentle and intelligent. When Buttercup nudged Clara's palm with her soft nose, Clara felt a surprising flutter of delight. "She likes you," Eliza observed with satisfaction. "Animals always know when people are good." Ethan showed Clara around the rest of the barn, explaining his breeding program and his plans for expanding the ranch. It was clear he was passionate about his work, and Clara found herself drawn into his enthusiasm, despite her own lack of experience with livestock. "How many acres do you have?" she asked as they walked back toward the house. 800, Ethan replied. "It's not the biggest spread in Montana, but it's mine. I built it from nothing, and I'm proud of what it's become." There was something in his voice that spoke of deep satisfaction, of a man who had found his place in the world through hard work and determination. Clara envied him that certainty, that sense of belonging somewhere. As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself falling more and more under the spell of Hollow Ridge. Eliza showed her the chicken coop, where a dozen hens pecked and clucked in their warm shelter. They visited the root cellar, where Ethan stored vegetables and preserves for the winter months. They even ventured to the small schoolhouse that Ethan had built behind the main house, where he conducted Eliza's daily lessons. "I used to be a teacher," Clara found herself admitting as she examined the neat rows of desks and the chalkboard covered with arithmetic problems. "Before I married Thomas." "Really?" Ethan's interest was genuine. "What grade?" "All of them," Clara said with a smile. "It was a one-room schoolhouse much like this one. I had children from 6 to 16 all learning together." "Did you like it?" Eliza asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "I loved it," Clara said honestly. "There's something magical about watching a child's face when they finally understand something they've been struggling with, like watching a light turn on behind their eyes." "Maybe you could teach me sometime," Eliza said hopefully. Papa's a good teacher, but he doesn't know much about girl things. Eliza, Ethan warned gently, but Clara could see he wasn't really upset. It's all right, Clara said. And yes, I'd be happy to teach you about girl things, whatever those might be. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, they returned to the house for supper. Ethan had prepared a simple meal of beef stew and biscuits, and while the biscuits were indeed a bit hard, as Eliza had warned, the stew was surprisingly good. Where did you learn to cook? Clara asked. Trial and error, mostly, Ethan admitted. My mother tried to teach me the basics before she died, but I'm afraid I didn't pay close enough attention at the time. I could teach you, Clara offered impulsively, then blushed at her boldness. I mean, if you'd like to learn. I'd like that very much, Ethan said quietly, and something in his tone made Clara's heart skip a beat. After supper, they sat by the fire while Eliza worked on a puzzle, and the adults sipped coffee. The domestic scene felt so natural, so right, that Clara had to remind herself this was just a visit, nothing more. Mrs. Whitmore, Eliza said suddenly, looking up from her puzzle. Are you sad? The question caught Clara off guard. What do you mean, sweetheart? Your eyes look sad sometimes, Eliza said with the brutal honesty of childhood. Like when Papa gets quiet and stares at Mama's picture. Clara glanced at Ethan, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. I suppose I am a little sad, she admitted. I lost someone I loved very much, just like your Papa did. Eliza nodded solemnly. It hurts, doesn't it? Even when people say it gets better. Yes, Clara said softly. It does hurt. But it gets a little better when you have people to take care of, Eliza continued with startling wisdom. That's what Papa says. That's why we have these dogs, and the horses, and each other. Clara's eyes filled with tears at the child's simple profundity. You're a very wise little girl, Eliza. Papa says I get that from Mama. Eliza replied matter-of-factly, then returned to her puzzle as if she hadn't just delivered one of the most insightful observations Clara had ever heard. As the evening wore on, Clara felt a peace settling over her that she hadn't experienced since before Thomas's death. There was something healing about this place, about these people who had welcomed her without judgment or condition. For the first time in months, she could imagine a future that didn't involve endless days of solitude and grief. When Ethan finally announced that it was time to drive Clara back to town, she felt a sharp pang of disappointment. The evening had passed so quickly, so pleasantly, that she'd almost forgotten this was supposed to be temporary. Do you have to go? Eliza asked, her small face crumpled with disappointment. Can't you stay for just one night? Eliza, Ethan said gently. Mrs. Whitmore has her own home to get back to. But as Clara looked around the warm, welcoming kitchen at the fire crackling in the hearth and the little girl who was already tugging at her heartstrings, she realized something profound. This felt more like home than anywhere she'd been since Thomas died. Actually, she heard herself saying, if you have somewhere I could sleep tonight, I'd like to stay. Just to see what it's like. Eliza's face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? You'll really stay? If your father doesn't mind, Clara said, looking at Ethan uncertainly. I don't mind at all, he said quietly. In fact, I was hoping you might. Something passed between them, in that moment an understanding that went deeper than words. Clara felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. And for the first time in years, she felt like a woman rather than just a widow. I'll take the sofa, she offered. Absolutely not, Ethan said firmly. You'll take the guest room upstairs. I've got clean linens and it's got its own fireplace. As Ethan went to prepare the guest room and Eliza got ready for bed, Clara stood by the kitchen window looking out at the star-filled sky. The silence of the ranch was different from the silence of her cabin, not empty and echoing, but full of possibility and peace. She was still standing there when Ethan returned, moving quietly. so as not to disturb his daughter, who had finally been coaxed into bed after extracting promises that Clara would still be there in the morning. "Second thoughts?" he asked gently, joining her at the window. "Just thinking," Clara replied. "This is all so unexpected. Yesterday morning I thought my life was over, and now... Clara turned to face him, struck by how different he looked in the firelight. Younger, somehow less weathered by responsibility and loss. "Now I'm wondering if maybe it's just beginning." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of possibility hanging between them, like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. "The offer stands," Ethan said finally, "for as long as you want it. This place, it needs a woman's touch. And Eliza needs..." "What does Eliza need?" Clara asked softly. "She needs what every little girl needs," Ethan said. "Someone to teach her about being a lady. Someone to braid her hair and tell her stories about princesses. Someone to show her that women can be strong and kind and beautiful in all the ways that matter." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Beautiful?" "Yes," Ethan said simply. "Beautiful. The way you were with her today, the way you listened to her stories and looked at her drawings like they were masterpieces, the way you made her feel important and heard. That's beautiful, Mrs. Whitmore. That's the kind of beauty that matters." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. When was the last time someone had called her beautiful? When was the last time someone had seen past her physical appearance to the woman she was inside? "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to start over." "You don't have to be strong," Ethan said, his voice gentle but certain. "You just have to be willing. The strength will come." As Clara finally made her way upstairs to the guest room, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Real, tangible hope that tomorrow might be better than today. That she might have found not just a job, but a purpose, not just a place to stay, but a place to belong. The guest room was cozy and welcoming, with a fire already crackling in the small fireplace and fresh linens that smelled of lavender and sunshine. As Clara prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror above the washstand. For the first time in months, the woman looking back at her didn't seem like a stranger. There was color in her cheeks, a spark in her eyes that had been missing for too long. As she settled into the comfortable bed, Clara could hear the soft sounds of the ranch settling for the night, the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance, the whisper of wind through the pine trees, the contented sigh of the house itself. It was a lullaby of belonging, of peace, of possibility. For the first time since Thomas's death, Clara Whitmore fell asleep with a smile on her face. The weeks that followed that first night at Hollow Ridge passed like pages in a beloved book, each day bringing new discoveries, small victories, and an unexpected sense of belonging that Clara had thought lost forever. She had officially moved to the ranch after 3 days of what was supposed to be a trial period. Her few possessions looking almost comically small in the spacious guest room that Ethan insisted she make her own. "It's not a guest room anymore," he'd said simply. "It's your room for as long as you want it." Clara had thrown herself into her new role with the determination of a woman who finally had purpose again. The kitchen, which had been Ethan's nemesis, became her domain. She scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, organized the pantry with military precision, and began the slow process of teaching both father and daughter the art of proper cooking. "No, sweetheart," Clara laughed as Eliza enthusiastically dumped what appeared to be half a cup of salt into their cookie dough. "Remember what we talked about? A pinch means just a tiny bit between your fingers." Eliza giggled, her flour-dusted cheeks pink with excitement. "Papa always says close enough when he's cooking." "Well, Papa's going to learn that in baking measurements matter," Clara said gently, guiding the child's small hands as they corrected the mixture. "Everything has to be just right, or we'll end up with cookies that could double as roof shingles." From across the kitchen, where he was supposedly mending a bridle, but had clearly been watching their lesson, Ethan chuckled. "I heard that Mrs. Whitmore, and for your information, my cooking isn't that bad." "Papa," Eliza said with the devastating honesty of childhood, "remember when you made those pancakes that were black on the outside and gooey on the inside? Even Biscuit wouldn't eat them, and he eats everything." Clara tried to hide her smile as Ethan's cheeks reddened slightly. "Perhaps we should focus on your father's many other talents," she suggested diplomatically. "Like what?" Eliza asked innocently. "Well, he built this beautiful house. He's teaching you to read and write. He can gentle a wild horse and fix anything that breaks around here." Clara's voice softened as she spoke, surprised by how easily the praise came. "Those are pretty remarkable talents." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes as he looked at her, a warmth that made Clara's pulse quicken. "Thank you," he said quietly. As the days grew longer and the winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the land, Clara found herself settling into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. She woke before dawn to start the coffee and begin breakfast, then spent the morning hours teaching Eliza lessons that went far beyond reading and arithmetic. Together, they learned about flowers and herbs, about the proper way to set a table, and about the art of making a house feel like a home. "Why do we have to learn about place settings?" Eliza asked one particularly bright morning as Clara showed her the proper arrangement of silverware. "We're just going to eat off them anyway." "Because," Clara explained patiently, "there's a difference between eating and dining. When we take the time to make things beautiful, even ordinary things, we're showing respect for ourselves and for the people we care about." Eliza considered this solemnly. "So when I grow up and have my own house, I should always use the good dishes. You should use whatever makes you feel proud of your home and happy to share it with others," Clara replied. "Sometimes that's fine china, and sometimes it's tin plates around a campfire. What matters is the love you put into it." These were the moments that filled Clara's heart to overflowing. Watching this bright, eager child absorb not just information, but wisdom, seeing Eliza's confidence grow with each small accomplishment. The little girl had begun to walk differently, shoulders back and chin raised as if she was finally beginning to understand her own worth. Afternoons were usually spent with Ethan, and Clara was surprised to discover how much she enjoyed his company. He was a thoughtful man, slow to speak, but wise when he did. And he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard just when she thought she had him figured out. "You know," he said one day, as they worked together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a winter storm, "I never expected you to be so handy with tools." Clara looked down at the hammer in her capable hands, then back at the fence post she'd just secured. "My father believed girls should know how to fix things as well as boys," she said. "He said dependence was just another word for helplessness." "Smart man," Ethan observed. "I wish more people thought that way." "Thomas certainly didn't," Clara said before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Ethan was quiet for a moment, then asked gently, "What did Thomas think?" Clara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But there was something about Ethan's steady presence that invited honesty. "He thought women should be ornamental," she said finally. "Beautiful and fragile and utterly dependent on their husbands for everything. When I gained weight after we married, when I couldn't seem to have children, I think he saw me as a failed ornament." "Then he was a fool," Ethan said with quiet conviction. The simple statement hit Clara like a physical blow. Not because it was cruel, but because it was kind, because it suggested that maybe, just maybe, the failure hadn't been hers alone. "You don't know what I was like then," she whispered. "I know what you're like now," Ethan replied, his blue eyes steady on hers. "And I know that any man who couldn't see your worth was blind. That night, as Clara lay in her bed listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, she allowed herself to think about Ethan's words. For so long, she had carried Thomas's disappointment like a stone in her chest, believing that she had somehow failed as a wife, as a woman. But what if the failure hadn't been hers? What if she had simply married a man who was incapable of seeing past the surface to the woman beneath? The thought was both liberating and terrifying. Spring arrived at Hollow Ridge like a shy visitor, tentatively at first, and then with growing confidence. The snow began to retreat, revealing patches of brown earth that would soon be green with new grass. Clara and Eliza spent hours planning the garden they would plant, poring over seed catalogs and debating the merits of roses versus sunflowers. "I think we should plant everything," Eliza declared with the boundless optimism of childhood. "Flowers and vegetables and herbs and maybe some berry bushes." "That's quite an ambitious plan," Clara said, but she was already mentally designing beds and calculating space. The truth was, she was as excited about the garden as Eliza was. It had been years since she had had the space or the heart to grow anything, and the prospect of nurturing something from seed to harvest filled her with anticipation. "Papa says you can make anything grow," Eliza continued. "He says you have magic hands." Clara's cheeks warmed at the compliment. "I don't know about magic, but I do love gardening. There's something wonderful about helping things grow." It was true. In the weeks since her arrival at Hollow Ridge, Clara had quietly taken over the care of the houseplants that had been struggling under Ethan's well-meaning but inadequate attention. Under her care, they had begun to flourish, their leaves growing greener and their blooms more abundant. "It's like you speak their language," Eliza observed one day as she watched Clara repot a struggling geranium. "How do you know what they need?" "I listen," Clara said simply. "Plants have ways of telling you what's wrong if you pay attention, just like people do." The comparison wasn't lost on Eliza, who had begun to confide in Clara about things she'd never shared with her father. Small fears and dreams, questions about her mother, wondering about what it meant to be a girl growing up in a world of men. "Do you think I'll be pretty when I grow up?" Eliza asked one evening as Clara braided her hair for bed. The question broke Clara's heart a little. "You're already pretty," she said firmly. "But more importantly, you're kind and smart and brave. Those are the things that make a woman truly beautiful." "But boys don't like smart girls," Eliza said with the matter-of-fact sadness of someone who had already learned harsh lessons about the world. "Then those boys aren't worth your time," Clara replied fiercely. "A real man, a good man, wants a woman who can think and speak her mind and stand on her own 2 feet. Don't ever make yourself smaller to make someone else comfortable." Eliza turned in her chair to look at Clara with wide, solemn eyes. "Is that why you're not married anymore? Because you're smart?" The innocent question hit Clara like a punch to the stomach. How could she explain to this precious child that sometimes love wasn't enough? That sometimes people grew apart in ways that couldn't be bridged? That sometimes the person you married turned out to be someone you'd never really known at all? "It's complicated, sweetheart," Clara said finally. "But yes, I think maybe it was partly because I was too much myself for the man I married." "Then he was stupid," Eliza declared with the fierce loyalty of childhood. "Papa says being yourself is the only thing worth being." That night, Clara found herself thinking about Thomas more clearly than she had in months. Without the haze of grief and guilt that had clouded her memories, she could see their marriage more objectively. Thomas had been a good man in many ways, but he had wanted a wife who would be content to fade into the background of his life. He had wanted someone who would smile and nod and never challenge him, never have opinions of her own, never take up too much space in any room. For a while, Clara had tried to be that woman. She had bitten her tongue when he made decisions without consulting her, had pretended to agree with opinions she found troubling, had slowly diminished herself in 1,000 small ways. But grief and isolation had stripped away those pretenses, leaving her raw and real and utterly herself. Maybe that was why the people of Hollow Creek had been so cruel that day at church. They had seen a woman who was no longer trying to make herself acceptable, no longer apologizing for taking up space in the world. They had seen the truth of who she was, and it had frightened them. But here at Hollow Ridge with Ethan and Eliza, that same truth was welcomed. Here her opinions mattered. Her knowledge was valued. Her presence was not just tolerated, but celebrated. The realization was both healing and revolutionary. As spring deepened into early summer, the ranch came alive with new energy. The horses grew sleek and spirited on the rich grass. The cattle grew fat and content, and the garden that Clara and Eliza had planted began to show the first green shoots of promise. "Look," Eliza squealed one morning, tugging Clara toward the vegetable patch. "The beans are coming up." Sure enough, tiny green shoots had pushed through the soil overnight, their leaves unfurling like miniature flags of victory. Clara knelt beside the garden bed, her heart swelling with the simple joy of watching life emerge from seemingly dead ground. "It's a miracle, isn't it?" she murmured gently, touching one of the tender shoots. "What is—" Ethan's voice came from behind her, and Clara turned to find him watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This," she said, gesturing to the garden. "New life coming from nothing but seeds and soil and faith." "And hard work," Ethan added, but his tone was gentle. "Don't forget the hard work." Clara smiled. "No, we mustn't forget that." Their eyes met and held for a moment longer than necessary, and Clara felt that familiar flutter in her chest that seemed to happen more and more often when Ethan looked at her that way. There was something in his gaze that made her feel seen, truly seen, in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "Papa," Eliza interrupted, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around her. "Clara says we can have fresh vegetables for supper every night once everything grows up, and flowers for the table too." "That sounds wonderful," Ethan said, though his eyes remained on Clara's face. "I can't remember the last time this place felt so alive." The comment was casual, but something in his tone made Clara's breath catch. When was the last time anyone had associated her with life, with vitality, with growth? For so long she had felt like a burden, a disappointment, a shadow of what she was supposed to be. But here in this garden, with dirt under her fingernails and sun on her face, she felt vibrantly, powerfully alive. As the weeks passed, Clara began to notice changes in herself that went deeper than her growing contentment. She was sleeping better, eating with actual appetite rather than mere habit, and laughing more than she had in years. The constant ache of grief that had settled in her chest was still there, but it had softened from a sharp pain to a gentle melancholy, like an old scar that only ached in bad weather. More surprisingly, she had begun to see herself differently. The mirror in her room no longer showed her a woman who was too much, too large, too disappointing. Instead, she saw someone who was capable and needed someone whose hands could comfort a crying child and whose mind could solve the dozen small problems that arose on a working ranch every day. "You look different," Eliza observed one evening as they worked together to shell peas for supper. "Happier." "Do I?" Clara asked, genuinely curious. Your eyes smile now, even when your mouth isn't. Before they were always sad, even when you were being nice." The child's observation was startlingly accurate. Clara had become so accustomed to carrying her grief like armor that she hadn't realized how it had affected everything about her, even the way she looked at the world. "You know what I think?" Eliza continued, her small fingers working efficiently at the pea pods. "I think you were meant to be here. With us." The simple statement hit Clara with unexpected force. Meant to be here. When was the last time she had felt meant to be anywhere? What makes you say that? Clara asked softly. Eliza looked up from her work, her blue eyes serious beyond her years. Because everything's better since you came. The food tastes better, the house feels warmer, Papa smiles more, and I have someone to talk to about girl things. Plus, the flowers are happy. The flowers are happy. Look at them, Eliza said, pointing through the kitchen window to where the garden bloomed in riotous color. They're practically dancing. Plants know when they're loved. Clara followed the child's gaze to the garden they had created together. It was indeed spectacular, a testament to careful planning, hard work, and what could only be called love. The vegetables grew in neat, abundant rows, while flowers spilled over their borders in glorious profusion. It was everything Clara had dreamed a garden could be. You're right, she said quietly. They do seem happy. That evening, as Clara was cleaning up after supper, she heard voices from the front porch and recognized the sound of visitors. Through the kitchen window, she could see Ethan talking with two men. She didn't recognize their horses tied to the hitching post. Something in their posture and the way they stood too close to Ethan made her uneasy. She was drying the last of the dishes when Ethan came back inside, his expression troubled. Who were those men? Clara asked. Neighbors, Ethan said shortly. Or, I suppose I should say, former neighbors. The Morrison brothers from the spread south of here. Clara frowned. Former neighbors? They sold their ranch last month to a man named Pemberton. Seems he's been buying up land all over the county, pushing out the smaller ranchers. The name Pemberton sent a chill down Clara's spine. Not Judge Pemberton from town. His son, actually. Judge Pemberton's boy has big plans for this area according to the Morrison brothers. Plans that apparently don't include small independent ranchers like me. Clara set down the dish towel with hands that had begun to shake. The Pembertons. The same family that had laughed at her in church, that had made her feel like less than nothing. And now, they were threatening the peace she had found here, the life she was building with Ethan and Eliza. What kind of plans? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Cattle empire, Ethan said grimly. Young Pemberton wants to consolidate all the ranches in this valley into one massive operation. He's been making offers to buy people out, and when they refuse... Ethan's jaw tightened. Let's just say the Morrison brothers suggested I might want to consider selling before things get unpleasant. Fear settled in Clara's stomach like a stone. Is he threatening you? Not directly. Not yet. But the Morrison brothers seem to think it would be in my best interest to take whatever offer comes my way. Clara sank into a chair, her mind racing. She had been so happy here, so content, that she had almost forgotten about the world beyond Hollow Ridge. But the world had a way of intruding, of reminding you that peace was always temporary, always fragile. What are you going to do? She asked. Ethan's expression was resolute. I'm not selling. This ranch is my life's work, Clara. It's Eliza's inheritance. I won't let some entitled rich boy chase me off my own land. Clara admired his determination, but she also knew the Pembertons. They were not people who accepted no for an answer, and they had the kind of money and influence that could make life very difficult for those who opposed them. Maybe we should think about this carefully, she said. The Pembertons are powerful people. If they want your land badly enough, then they can want it, Ethan said firmly. I built this place from nothing, Clara. Every board, every fence post, every improvement came from my own hands and sweat. I won't give it up without a fight. Looking at him in the lamplight, his jaw set with determination and his eyes blazing with conviction, Clara felt her heart skip a beat. This was a man who would fight for what he believed in, who would protect what he loved. And despite the danger, despite the fear that was already creeping into her bones, she found herself thinking that she would follow him into that fight. Because somewhere along the way, without her quite realizing it, Hollow Ridge had become worth fighting for. Ethan and Eliza had become worth fighting for. She had found her place in the world, and she would not give it up without a battle. The next few days passed in a strange tension, as if the entire ranch was holding its breath. Ethan went about his usual work, but Clara noticed he was more watchful than before, his eyes scanning the horizon more frequently, his hand resting more often on the rifle he kept by the door. Clara threw herself into her usual activities with extra vigor, as if by maintaining normalcy, she could somehow keep the threat at bay. She and Eliza spent long hours in the garden, weeding and watering and harvesting the early summer vegetables. She taught cooking lessons with renewed enthusiasm, filled the house with the scents of fresh bread and strawberry preserves, and made sure every surface gleamed with cleanliness. "You're being awfully industrious," Ethan observed one afternoon as he found her scrubbing the front porch with more energy than the task required. "I like to keep busy," Clara said, not pausing in her work. "Clara," Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me." Reluctantly, she stopped scrubbing and met his eyes. "You don't have to prove anything," he said quietly. "You belong here. Whatever happens with Pemberton, that doesn't change." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. "But what if—" "No what ifs," Ethan interrupted. "We'll deal with whatever comes when it comes. But you're part of this family now, Clara. You're home. Home." The word hit her like a physical blow, so sweet and so terrifying that she almost couldn't breathe. When was the last time anywhere had felt like home? When was the last time anyone had made her feel like she belonged somewhere? Not as a guest or a charity case, but as an essential part of something bigger than herself. "Thank you," she whispered, her throat tight with emotion. Ethan reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "No need to thank me for stating the obvious." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken words and possibilities. Clara felt herself leaning into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed as she allowed herself to feel safe, to feel cherished, to feel desired for the first time in years. "Papa, Clara." Eliza's voice shattered the intimate moment as she came running around the corner of the house, her face bright with excitement. "Come quick, something's happening with the horses." They hurried to the corral where the horses were indeed acting strangely bunched together at the far end of the enclosure, with their ears pricked forward and their nostrils flaring. Scout and the other dogs were barking frantically, their attention focused on something beyond the ranch buildings. "What is it?" Clara asked, her heart beginning to pound. Ethan's expression was grim as he shaded his eyes against the afternoon sun. "Riders, he said. "A lot of them." Clara followed his gaze and felt her blood turn to ice. In the distance, a cloud of dust marked the approach of perhaps a dozen mounted men. Too many to be a friendly visit, too organized to be casual travelers. "Eliza," Ethan said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "I want you to go inside with Clara. Right now." "But Papa." "Now, Eliza." The child, sensing the seriousness of the situation, didn't argue further. Clara took her small hand and led her toward the house, but she couldn't resist looking back over her shoulder at the approaching riders. At their head rode a man she recognized even at a distance. Judge Pemberton's son Marcus, his arrogant posture unmistakable even from far away. Behind him came men she didn't recognize, hard-faced and armed, the kind of men who were hired to do things that decent people wouldn't do themselves. "Clara," Ethan called, and she turned to find him watching her with an expression that made her stomach clench. "Take Eliza upstairs and keep her there. No matter what you hear, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "Ethan." "Promise me," he said urgently. Promise me you'll keep her safe." Clara looked at this man who had given her a new life, who had shown her what it meant to be valued and cherished, and felt her heart break a little. "I promise," she whispered. "But you be careful. You come back to us, do you hear me?" Something flickered in Ethan's eyes at her words. Something that looked almost like hope. "I'll do my best," he said softly. As Clara hurried Eliza upstairs and tried to keep the child calm while the sound of approaching hooves grew louder, she found herself praying to a God she hadn't spoken to in months. "Please," she begged silently. "Please don't let me lose this. Please don't let them take away the only happiness I've found." Outside, she could hear voices, now Marcus Pemberton's cultured tones mixing with Ethan's steady responses. The conversation was too muted for her to make out words, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. Eliza pressed close to Clara's side, her small body trembling with fear. "What do they want, Clara?" "I don't know, sweetheart." Clara lied, wrapping her arms around the child. "But your papa will handle it. He's very brave and very smart." Through the upstairs window, Clara could see the group of riders spread out in a rough semicircle around Ethan, who stood alone on his own front porch. The sight made her blood boil. How dare they come to his home like this, threatening him with their numbers and their weapons? But as she watched, something unexpected happened. One of the horses, a young stallion that had been giving Ethan trouble for weeks, suddenly reared and broke away from its rider. The animal bolted straight toward the corral where the other horses were still bunched together in nervous confusion. In the chaos that followed, Clara saw something that made her heart stop. Eliza, who had apparently slipped away from her side while she was focused on the window, was running across the yard toward the corral directly into the path of the panicked stallion. Without thinking, without hesitation, "Fahren." Clara flew down the stairs and out the front door. Her only thought to reach the child before the horse did. Behind her, she heard Ethan's shout of alarm, heard the confusion and noise of the mounted men. But all that mattered was getting to Eliza before it was too late. Time seemed to slow as Clara ran, her feet flying over the ground that had become so familiar, so beloved. She could see the terror on Eliza's face as the child realized her danger, could see the wild eyes of the stallion as it bore down on them both. There was no time to think, no time to calculate odds or consider consequences. There was only love, pure and fierce and unstoppable, driving Clara forward into the path of danger to save the child who had become the daughter of her heart. She reached Eliza just as the stallion thundered past, sweeping the little girl into her arms and throwing them both to the ground in a tangle of skirts and dust and desperate protective love. The horse's hooves pounded past them so close that Clara could feel the wind of its passage, could smell the sweat and fear musk of the animal as it careened toward the safety of the corral. For a moment the world was silent, except for the sound of Clara's ragged breathing and Eliza's frightened sobs. Then suddenly Ethan was there, his hands gentle but urgent as he checked them both for injuries, his face white with terror and relief. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Either of you?" "I don't think so," Clara gasped, still clutching Eliza to her chest. "Eliza, sweetheart, are you all right?" The child nodded against her shoulder, her small arms wrapped tightly around Clara's neck. "You saved me," she whispered. "You could have been hurt, but you saved me anyway." Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she held this precious child, this gift she had been given when she thought her life was over. "Of course I did," she said fiercely. "Of course I did." Around them, the mounted men had begun to control their own frightened horses. But Clara was only dimly aware of their presence. All that mattered was the solid weight of Eliza in her arms, the knowledge that they were both safe, the feeling of Ethan's strong hands helping them both to their feet. It was only as she stood brushing dust from her skirts and checking Eliza one more time for injuries that Clara became aware of the silence that had fallen over the yard. She looked up to find every man there, Pemberton and his hired guns alike, staring at her with expressions that ranged from amazement to something that might have been respect. "Well," said Marcus Pemberton, his cultured voice cutting through the silence. "That was quite a display of courage, Mrs. Whitmore," Clara said, lifting her chin as she faced the man who represented everything she had fled from. "Clara Whitmore." Recognition dawned in Pemberton's eyes, followed quickly by a sneer that made Clara's blood boil. Ah, yes, the widow woman who made such a spectacle of herself at church last winter. I should have recognized the distinctive silhouette. The insult hit Clara like a physical blow. But before she could respond, Ethan stepped forward with murder in his eyes. "You'll apologize to Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "Right now." Pemberton laughed, but there was nervousness in the sound. "I hardly think, right now," Ethan repeated, and something in his tone made several of the hired men shift uneasily in their saddles. The standoff stretched for a moment that felt like eternity. Then Eliza, still in Clara's arms, spoke up with the clear, carrying voice of childhood innocence. "You're wrong about Clara," she said to Pemberton, her blue eyes flashing with indignation. "She's the prettiest lady in all of Montana. Papa says so all the time." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Clara felt her heart stop as she realized what the child had said. She looked at Ethan, saw the truth in his eyes, saw the way he was looking at her as if she were indeed the most beautiful woman in the world. And in that moment, with dust in her hair and dirt on her dress and a frightened child in her arms, Clara finally understood what Ethan had been trying to tell her all along. Beauty wasn't about size or youth or perfection. Beauty was about courage and love and the willingness to risk everything for someone else's safety. Beauty was about being exactly who you were meant to be. The words that fell from Eliza's innocent lips seemed to echo across the ranch yard, like a bell tolling each syllable, carrying a weight that shifted something fundamental in the very air around them. Clara felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of embarrassment and something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope as she processed what the child had just declared to this gathering of hostile strangers. Marcus Pemberton's face twisted with cruel amusement. "The prettiest lady in Montana," he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "Well, that's certainly a charitable assessment from someone so young and inexperienced in the ways of the world." But even as he spoke, Clara noticed that several of his men were looking at her with something other than derision. They had seen her throw herself into danger to save a child, had witnessed the kind of selfless courage that transcended physical appearances. In their weathered faces, she saw a grudging respect that Pemberton's wealth could never buy. Ethan stepped closer to Clara and Eliza, his presence a shield against the cruel words. "My daughter speaks the truth as she sees it," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the yard with absolute certainty. "And she sees more clearly than most adults I know." "How touching," Pemberton sneered. "But I'm afraid sentiment won't change the facts of our business here today, Dyer. I've come to make you an offer for this land, and I strongly suggest you consider it carefully." "I've already given you my answer," Ethan replied, his tone steady as granite. "This ranch isn't for sale." Pemberton's expression hardened. "Everything's for sale at the right price, and sometimes circumstances have a way of adjusting what people consider the right price." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire, acrid and dangerous. Clara felt Eliza tense in her arms, the child's intuitive understanding of adult conflict making her press closer for comfort. Around them, the hired men shifted in their saddles' hands, resting casually but meaningfully near their weapons. "Are you threatening me on my own land?" Ethan asked, his voice deceptively calm. "I'm simply pointing out economic realities," Pemberton replied smoothly. "Cattle prices are volatile. Accidents happen. Weather can be unpredictable. A man with a child to think about might find himself reconsidering what's truly important. The mention of Eliza sent ice through Clara's veins. She looked at this man who wore expensive clothes and spoke with educated diction, and saw the kind of cruelty that money and privilege could breed. The assumption that want and need could be manufactured, that people could be broken down and remade according to someone else's vision. "Mr. Pemberton," Clara heard herself saying, her voice cutting through the tension with surprising strength. "I believe you've made your position clear. Perhaps it's time for you and your men to leave." Every eye turned to her, and Clara felt the familiar flutter of panic that came with being the center of attention. But this time, instead of shame, she felt something else rising in her chest, a fierce protectiveness that burned away her self-consciousness like fire-consuming paper. Pemberton's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "How presumptuous of you, Mrs. Whitmore. But then I suppose desperation makes people forget their place." "My place," Clara said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is wherever I choose to make it. And I choose to make it here with people who value decency over dollars and courage over cruelty." "Courage?" Pemberton laughed, but the sound was forced. "Is that what you call your little display? Throwing yourself in front of a horse like some melodramatic heroine from a dime novel?" "I call it love," Clara replied simply, and the honesty in her voice seemed to silence even the wind. "Something you might not recognize given your current company." She gestured to the hired gunmen surrounding them, men whose very presence spoke of violence held barely in check. Several of them had the grace to look uncomfortable at her words, shifting in their saddles like schoolboys caught in mischief. Pemberton's face flushed red with anger. "You forget yourself, madam. You're nothing but a fat widow who couldn't hold on to her first husband, and now fancies herself some kind of pioneer woman. Do you really think this charade will last? Do you think Dyer here won't come to his senses once he realizes, oh, what a burden you've become?" The words hit Clara like physical blows, each one designed to find her deepest insecurities and tear them open. For a moment she felt the familiar shame wash over her, the voice in her head that whispered that he was right, that she was fooling herself, that she would always be too much for any man to truly want. But then she felt Eliza's small hand slip into hers, felt the child's absolute trust and affection, and she remembered the way Ethan had looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, not with pity or obligation, but with something that might have been wonder. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "I've spent enough of my life listening to men like you tell me what I am and what I'm worth. I won't waste another moment of it." She turned to face Ethan, her heart pounding with a combination of terror and determination. "Ethan, I think it's time these gentlemen left your property. Unless they have legal business here, I believe they're trespassing." Ethan's eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch pride admiration, and something deeper that made her pulse race. "You heard the lady?" he said, his gaze never leaving Clara's face. "You're not welcome here." Pemberton's face had gone from red to purple with rage. "This isn't over, Dyer. Not by a long shot. There are more ways than one to convince a man to see reason. And there are laws against most of them," Ethan replied evenly. "I suggest you remember that." "Laws," Pemberton spat. "Laws are for people who can't afford to make their own rules. You'll learn that soon enough." He wheeled his horse around with unnecessary violence, causing the animal to rear and fight against the bit. His men followed suit, but Clara noticed that several of them tipped their hats to her as they passed, a small gesture of respect that somehow meant more than all of Pemberton's bluster. As the dust cloud of their departure settled, Clara found herself still standing in the ranch yard, Eliza in her arms and Ethan beside her, the three of them forming a small circle of solidarity against the world. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. "Well," Ethan said, finally, his voice rough with emotion. "That was certainly interesting." Clara laughed, surprising herself with the sound. "That's one way to put it." She set Eliza down gently, smoothing the child's hair with trembling hands. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Eliza nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry I ran outside when you told me to stay upstairs. I just heard the horses, and I wanted to see what was happening." "I know," Clara said, kneeling to meet the child's eyes. "But running toward frightened animals is very dangerous. You could have been seriously hurt." "But you saved me," Eliza said simply, "just like a mama would." The words hit Clara like a thunderbolt, so unexpected and so profound that she felt her knees nearly buckle. She looked up at Ethan, saw the same shock and wonder in his face that she felt in her own heart. "Eliza," Ethan said softly. "What did you just say?" "I said Clara saved me like a mama would," Eliza repeated, looking between them with the puzzled expression of someone who doesn't understand why adults find the obvious so surprising. "That's what mamas do, isn't it? They keep their children safe, even when it's scary." Clara felt tears spilling down her cheeks as she looked at this beautiful, motherless child who had somehow decided that she, broken, grieving Clara, was worthy of that most sacred of titles. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, I know you're not my real mama," Eliza continued with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "But you take care of me like one. You teach me things and make good food and tell me stories and make sure I'm safe. And you love me. I can tell." "Yes," Clara said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I do love you. So very much." Eliza smiled, a radiant expression that lit up her entire face. "And Papa loves you too. I can tell that too." The child's declaration hung in the air between them, electric with possibility and terror. Clara's eyes met Ethan's over Eliza's head, and in that moment she saw her own heart reflected back at her, the hope and fear and desperate longing that had been growing between them for months. "Eliza," Ethan said gently, "why don't you go check on the horses? Make sure they're all settled down after that excitement." "Okay, Papa," Eliza said cheerfully, apparently oblivious to the magnitude of what she had just revealed. She skipped toward the corral, calling to the dogs who bounded after her with enthusiasm. Clara and Ethan stood alone in the ranch yard. The space between them suddenly charged with everything that had been left unsaid for so long. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for Ethan to speak to confirm or deny what his daughter had so innocently proclaimed. "Clara," Ethan said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "What Eliza said about me loving you." "You don't have to explain," Clara said quickly, terrified of what he might say. "Children sometimes see things that aren't there, or they wish for things." "She's right," Ethan interrupted, the words coming out in a rush. "God help me, she's absolutely right. I do love you." Clara felt the world tilt sideways. "Ethan, I've been fighting it for weeks." He continued, the words spilling out as if a dam had burst inside him. "Telling myself it was too soon, that you were still grieving, that I had no right to feel this way. But when I saw you throw yourself in front of that horse today, when I thought I might lose you..." His voice broke. "Clara, I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep acting like you're just the housekeeper. Like what I feel for you is just gratitude or friendship." Clara stared at him, this strong, kind man who had given her a home when she had nowhere else to go, who had seen value in her when she couldn't see it in herself. "But I'm not the kind of woman men like you usually..." "What kind of woman am I supposed to like?" Ethan asked, stepping closer to her. "Someone who cares more about her appearance than her character. Someone who would let a child walk into danger rather than risk her own safety. Someone who would stand silent while bullies threatened her family. Your family, Clara whispered. Not mine. Isn't it? Ethan asked, his blue eyes searching her face. Haven't you been part of this family since the day you arrived? Haven't you made this house a home, made my daughter bloom like a flower in spring, made me remember what it feels like to hope for something more than just surviving each day? Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she struggled to process what he was telling her. I'm not beautiful, Ethan. I'm not young or slender or any of the things that men want in a wife. You're wrong, Ethan said fiercely, reaching up to cup her face in his calloused hands. You're beautiful in every way that matters. You're beautiful when you're teaching Eliza to braid her hair, when you're kneading bread in the morning sunlight, when you're reading by the fire in the evening. You're beautiful when you're angry at injustice, and when you're gentle with hurt animals, and when you're brave enough to face down men like Pemberton. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. But most of all, you're beautiful when you smile, really smile like you did the first morning you woke up in this house and realized you were home. Ethan, Clara breathed, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. I know this is sudden, he said urgently. I know you might need time to think, to grieve, to figure out what you want. But Clara, I can't let another day pass without telling you how I feel. You've brought light back into my life, into Eliza's life. You've made us a family. Clara looked into his eyes and saw nothing but truth. Nothing but love so pure and honest that it took her breath away. This man wasn't asking her to be smaller or quieter or different than she was. He was asking her to be exactly herself, to bring all her strength and passion and stubborn determination into a life they would build together. I love you too. She whispered the words, feeling like a prayer and a promise all at once. I think I've loved you since the day you defended me to your daughter, since you saw something in me worth saving. Ethan's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. So what do we do now? Before Clara could answer, Eliza's voice rang out from the corral. Papa Clara, come quick! They turned to see the child standing by the fence, her face bright with excitement as she pointed toward the road that led back to town. In the distance, a lone rider was approaching, but this time there was nothing threatening about the figure. As it drew closer, Clara recognized Pastor Williams from the Hollow Creek Church, his kindly face familiar even at a distance. Pastor Williams, Ethan called as the man approached. What brings you all the way out here? The pastor dismounted with the careful movements of a man more accustomed to pulpits than saddles. I heard about the trouble you had today, he said, his expression concerned. Young Marcus Pemberton was in town bragging about his visit to Hollow Ridge. I thought I should come check on you folks. Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. If Pemberton had been talking in town, then by now, everyone in Hollow Creek would know about the confrontation, about her presence at the ranch, about the things that had been said. We're fine, Pastor, Ethan said carefully. No real harm done. Pastor Williams nodded, but his eyes were troubled. I'm glad to hear it. But I'm afraid Marcus wasn't content to keep his opinions to himself. He's been telling anyone who will listen that you're harboring and, well, he used some rather unkind words to describe Mrs. Whitmore. Clara's heart sank. She had been so happy, so hopeful just moments before, and now the ugly reality of small-town gossip was creeping back into her life like a poisonous fog. What exactly did he say? Ethan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Pastor Williams looked uncomfortable. He suggested that Mrs. Whitmore was taking advantage of your kindness. He painted a picture of an immoral arrangement that has some folks quite stirred up. Some folks need to mind their own business, Ethan said bluntly. I agree, Pastor Williams said quickly. But the truth is, there are people in town who are concerned about the situation. about an unmarried woman living alone with you and Eliza. Clara felt the familiar shame wash over her, the sense that she was somehow dirty or wrong simply by existing in a way that didn't fit other people's narrow definitions of propriety. "I should go," she said quietly. "I should pack my things and leave before this gets worse." "No," Ethan said firmly, turning to face her. "Absolutely not." "But Pastor Williams is right," Clara said, her voice breaking. "People are talking, making assumptions. I won't have Eliza hurt by gossip about her father and me." "Then we'll give them something else to talk about," Ethan said, his voice clear and certain. Pastor Williams looked between them with growing understanding. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Ethan took Clara's hands in his grip warm and steady and sure. "I'm saying that I want to marry this woman, if she'll have me. I want to make her my wife in the eyes of God and the law and anyone else who cares to know." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan, you don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted. "Not because of gossip or social pressure, but because I love you. Because I want to wake up beside you every morning for the rest of my life. Because I want Eliza to have the mother she deserves, and I want to have the family I never dared hope for." He dropped to one knee right there in the ranch yard, still holding her hands, his blue eyes blazing with love and determination. "Clara Whitmore, will you marry me?" The world seemed to stop spinning. Clara looked down at this good, strong man kneeling in the dust for her, offering her not just his name, but his heart, his home, his future. Behind him, she could see Eliza jumping up and down with excitement, her small face radiant with joy. Even Pastor Williams was smiling, his earlier concerns apparently forgotten in the face of such obvious love. "Yes," Clara whispered, then louder. "Yes, Ethan Dyer, I will marry you." Ethan surged to his feet and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as Eliza cheered and the dogs barked with excitement. When he finally set her down, Clara felt dizzy with happiness, with the sudden transformation of her life from cautious hope to radiant possibility. "Well," Pastor Williams said with a chuckle, "I suppose that solves the gossip problem rather neatly." "When?" Eliza demanded, bouncing on her toes. "When are you getting married? Can I pick flowers for the wedding? Can I call Clara Mama now?" Clara knelt down to hug the child, her heart overflowing with love for this bright, precious girl who had helped heal her broken places. "You can call me whatever feels right to you, sweetheart. And yes, you can definitely pick flowers." "As for when," Ethan said, looking at Pastor Williams hopefully, "how soon could we arrange it?" The pastor stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Well, there are certain protocols to observe, announcements to be made. But given the circumstances and the obvious sincerity of your feelings, I don't see why we couldn't perform the ceremony within the week." "A week?" Clara's head spun at the speed of everything. "Is that enough time to plan a proper wedding? What do we need besides each other and Pastor Williams?" Ethan asked, his hand still holding hers as if he was afraid she might disappear. "We'll have the ceremony right here at the ranch, under the cottonwood tree by the creek. Eliza can pick all the wildflowers she wants, and you can wear whatever makes you happy." Clara thought of her old wedding dress, yellowed with age, and stretched beyond recognition, and realized she didn't want to wear it anyway. That dress belonged to a different woman, a different life. This wedding would be theirs alone, simple and honest, and full of the kind of love that didn't need elaborate trappings to make it real. "That sounds perfect," she said softly. As Pastor Williams prepared to leave, promising to return the following Sunday for the ceremony, Clara found herself standing in the ranch yard trying to process the complete transformation of her life. This morning she had been a housekeeper and surrogate mother, grateful for a place to belong. Now she was a bride-to-be, a woman loved and wanted and cherished for exactly who she was. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked softly, apparently recognizing the overwhelmed expression on her face. "I'm terrified," Clara admitted, "and happy, and confused. How is it possible to feel so many things at once?" "I don't know," Ethan said, pulling her close. "But I feel them too." They stood together in the gathering dusk, holding each other while Eliza played with the dogs, and the ranch settled into evening quiet around them. Clara breathed in the scent of hay and horses, and the man who would soon be her husband, and felt something that had been clenched tight in her chest for months finally begin to relax. "Ethan," she said quietly, "what if Pemberton makes good on his threats? What if he tries to hurt the ranch or Eliza or—" "Then we'll face it together," Ethan said firmly. "As a family, as husband and wife. I'm not afraid of Marcus Pemberton, Clara. Not when I have something worth fighting for." Clara looked up at him. This man who had seen her at her lowest point and decided she was worth loving, and felt her fear begin to transform into something else. A fierce determination to protect what they were building, to fight for the happiness they had found. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts, and Clara felt her heart skip with renewed anxiety. But as the rider drew closer, she recognized the figure of Tom Morrison, one of the neighbors who had sold his ranch to Pemberton. "Ethan," Tom called as he approached, his face grim with urgency. "I've got news you need to hear." "What is it?" Ethan asked instinctively, moving to shield Clara and Eliza. Tom dismounted heavily, his weathered face creased with worry. "It's about Pemberton. He's not just buying up ranches, he's got something bigger planned. Something that involves the railroad." Clara felt ice form in her stomach. "The railroad? There's talk of a new spur line coming through this valley," Tom continued. "Pemberton's been buying up land right in the path of where the tracks are supposed to go. Word is he's got inside information from his father's political connections." Ethan's jaw tightened. So he's not just building a cattle empire. He's positioning himself to profit from the railroad development. "That's what it looks like," Tom confirmed. "And your ranch, Ethan Hollow Ridge, sits right in the middle of where that railroad's supposed to run. If Pemberton can't buy you out, he'll find another way to get the land," Ethan finished grimly. Clara felt the happiness of the evening drain away, like water from a broken bucket. Just when she had found love, found a future worth fighting for, the forces that had driven her from her old life were threatening to destroy her new one. "There's more," Tom said reluctantly. "Pemberton's been talking to the territorial authorities. He's claiming that small ranchers like you are obstacles to progress, that the territory would be better served by consolidating land ownership into the hands of people with the capital to develop it properly." "Meaning himself," Ethan said bitterly. "Meaning himself," Tom agreed. "And he's got the money and connections to make his arguments sound convincing to people who've never set foot in this valley." Clara looked around at the ranch that had become her sanctuary, at the home they were building together, and felt a surge of fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. She had run once before, had let cruel words and narrow minds drive her from her place in the world. She would not run again. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the fear churning in her stomach. Ethan looked at her with surprise and something that might have been pride. "We fight," he said simply. "We stand our ground, and we fight for what's ours." "Together," Clara added firmly. "We fight together." As Tom Morrison rode away into the darkness, carrying his warnings and his own bitter experience of what it meant to lose everything, to Marcus Pemberton's ambitions, Clara stood with her arm around Eliza and her hand in Ethan's, looking out over the land that had become her home. The battle for Hollow Ridge was just beginning. But for the first time in her life, Clara Whitmore was ready to fight for something that truly mattered. She had found her place in the world, had found love and family and purpose, and she would not give them up without a fight. The storm was coming, but she would not face it alone. The morning of what should have been the happiest day of Clara's life dawned gray and ominous, with heavy clouds gathering on the horizon like an army preparing for battle. She stood at her bedroom window, watching the wind whip through the cottonwood trees where she would be married in just a few hours, and tried to quiet the anxiety that had been building in her chest since Tom Morrison's warning 3 days ago. "Clara." Eliza's voice came from the doorway, soft and uncertain. "Are you scared about getting married?" Clara turned to find the child hovering in the doorway, her small face creased with worry. In her arms she clutched a bouquet of wildflowers. She had spent the morning gathering purple lupines, yellow buttercups, and white daisies that seemed to glow against her dark dress. "A little," Clara admitted, sitting on the edge of the bed and patting the space beside her. "But not about marrying your father. That's the one thing I'm completely sure about." Eliza climbed up beside her, careful not to crush the flowers. "Then what are you scared of?" Clara looked into those wise blue eyes that saw so much more than a 6-year-old should have to see, and decided that honesty was the only gift worth giving this child who had already endured too much loss. "I'm scared that bad people might try to hurt our family," she said simply. "I'm scared that what happened with Mr. Pemberton might not be over." Eliza nodded solemnly. "Papa's scared too, I can tell. He keeps checking the windows, and he put extra bullets in his rifle." The matter-of-fact way the child spoke about such serious things broke Clara's heart. No little girl should have to think about rifles and bullets on what was supposed to be a day of celebration. "But you know what?" Eliza continued, her voice brightening. "I'm not scared. Because now we'll really be a family, and families stick together no matter what." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the simple wisdom of the child's words. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. Families do stick together." "And besides," Eliza added with the pragmatic confidence of youth, "Papa's the strongest man in Montana, and you're the bravest lady, and I'm very smart for my age. That's what Pastor Williams says. So if any bad people come, we'll be ready for them." Despite her fears, Clara found herself smiling at Eliza's fierce determination. "Yes, I suppose we will be." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and Clara felt her heart leap with a mixture of hope and terror. Through the window, she could see a small group of riders approaching the ranch. But as they drew closer, she recognized friendly faces. Pastor Williams, as promised, along with Dr. Harrison from town, and his wife Margaret, one of the few women who had ever shown Clara genuine kindness. "The wedding guests are here," Eliza squealed, jumping up from the bed. "I have to tell Papa." As the child ran from the room, Clara took one last look at herself in the mirror. She wore a simple dress of deep blue cotton that Margaret Harrison had helped her alter to fit properly, with lace trim at the collar and cuffs that Eliza had insisted would make her look like a princess. Her hair was pinned up simply with a few loose curls framing her face, and the nervous flush in her cheeks actually made her look younger, healthier, more alive than she had in years. "You are beautiful," she told her reflection firmly, practicing the words Ethan had been teaching her to believe. "You are worthy of love. You are strong enough for whatever comes." The affirmations felt strange on her tongue, but they were getting easier to say, easier to believe. Love, she was learning, was not just about being cherished by someone else. It was about learning to cherish yourself. Downstairs, she found the small gathering assembled in the main room, their faces bright with genuine happiness for the couple. Harrison, a portly man with kind eyes and a gray beard, pumped Ethan's hand enthusiastically, while Margaret fussed over Eliza's bouquet and Pastor Williams consulted his prayer book. "Clara, my dear," Margaret said, hurrying over to embrace her. "You look absolutely radiant." "Doesn't she, Harold?" Dr. Harrison turned from his conversation with Ethan, his eyes twinkling. "Indeed she does." Ethan, you're a lucky man." "Don't I know it?" Ethan replied, his gaze finding Clara's across the room. The love in his eyes was so clear, so unwavering that Clara felt her remaining fears begin to settle. Whatever storms might come, they would weather them together. "Well then," Pastor Williams said, closing his prayer book with a satisfied snap. "Shall we proceed? I believe the bride and groom are more than ready to become husband and wife." They walked together to the cottonwood tree by the creek, where Eliza had scattered flower petals in a rough circle, and someone, probably Ethan, had hung garlands of wildflowers from the lower branches. It was simple and rustic and absolutely perfect, a setting that spoke of love, grown organically from the soil of shared work and mutual respect. As Pastor Williams began the ceremony, Clara found herself thinking about the woman she had been just months ago, broken, ashamed, convinced that her life was over. That woman could never have imagined standing here in the Montana sunshine, promising to love and honor a man who saw her as a gift rather than a burden. "Do you, Ethan Dyer, take Clara Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Ethan said, his voice clear and strong, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "And do you, Clara Whitmore, take Ethan Dyer to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Clara opened her mouth to speak the words that would bind her life to his, and found herself thinking about that phrase, for better or worse. She had married Thomas with such naive optimism, believing that love was all they would ever need. Now she was older, wiser, scarred by loss and disappointment. She knew that love was not a shield against the world's cruelties, but she also knew that it was the only thing that made those cruelties bearable. "I do," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and sweet, full of promise and hope, and the quiet certainty of two people who had found their way to each other through the wilderness of grief and loneliness. When they broke apart, Clara saw tears in Ethan's eyes that matched her own. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pastor Williams announced with a broad smile, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Dyer." The small group erupted in cheers and applause, and Eliza launched herself at both of them, wrapping her arms around their legs in an exuberant hug that nearly knocked them over. "Now I really have a mama," she declared, her face shining with joy. "And Papa has someone to make sure his biscuits don't burn." The laughter that followed was warm and genuine, the kind of happiness that seemed to make the very air sparkle with possibility. Clara felt lighter than she had in years, as if some great weight had been lifted from her shoulders and carried away on the Montana wind. But even as they celebrated with cake and coffee on the front porch, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were living in a bubble of happiness that might burst at any moment. She found herself scanning the horizon for dust clouds, listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats, unable to fully relax into the joy of the moment. Her fears proved justified when, just as the sun was beginning to set and their guests were preparing to leave, the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed shattered the peaceful atmosphere. Clara felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the familiar formation, Marcus Pemberton and his hired guns riding hard toward the ranch. "Get inside," Ethan said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle propped against the porch railing. "All of you." "No," Clara said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "We stand together. That's what families do." Dr. Harrison and his wife exchanged worried glances, but Pastor Williams stepped forward to stand beside Ethan and Clara, his jaw set with determination. "I'll not see newlyweds threatened on their wedding day," he said quietly. The riders thundered into the ranch yard in a cloud of dust and menace, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with purpose. Marcus Pemberton sat his horse like a conquering general, his expensive clothes and polished boots a stark contrast to the working men around him. "Well, well," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "It seems congratulations are in order. Though I have to wonder if the bride realizes she's just tied herself to a sinking ship." "State your business and get off my land," Ethan replied, his voice deadly calm. "Oh, I think you'll find it's not your land much longer," Pemberton said with a cruel smile. "You see, I've just come from a very productive meeting with the territorial governor. It seems there are some irregularities with your deed, Dyer. Questions about the original survey, some missing documentation that calls the entire ownership into question." Clara felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that this ranch was never legally transferred to Mr. Dyer here," Pemberton said smoothly. "The previous owner's estate was never properly settled, which means the sale was invalid. Which means, legally speaking, this land belongs to whoever can establish the strongest claim." "That's impossible," Ethan said, but Clara could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I have the deed. I paid for this land fair and square." "Do you have the original survey documents?" Pemberton asked with mock concern. "The estate settlement papers, the death certificate for the previous owner, because according to the Territorial Records Office, several of those documents seem to have gone missing." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. Documents didn't just go missing, they were made to disappear by people with enough money and influence to corrupt the system. The Pembertons had been planning this for longer than any of them had realized. "Even if what you're saying is true," Pastor Williams interjected, "there are legal processes that must be followed. You can't simply declare someone's land ownership invalid without proper proceedings." "Oh, but I can," Pemberton replied with satisfaction. "You see, I've taken the liberty of filing a claim with the Territorial Land Office. As of this morning, I am the legal claimant to this property pending resolution of the ownership dispute. Which means, effectively, you're all trespassing." "You son of a—" Ethan started forward, but Clara caught his arm. "Ethan, no," she said quietly. "That's what he wants. He wants you to do something that will give him an excuse to have you arrested." Pemberton's smile widened. "Your new wife is wiser than you are, Dyer. She understands the situation perfectly. You have 24 hours to remove yourself and your belongings from this property. After that, anyone found here will be dealt with as trespassers." "And if we refuse?" Clara asked, her voice steady, despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Then I'll have the territorial marshal remove you by force," Pemberton replied. "Along with arrest warrants for illegal occupation of territorial land. I'm sure your new husband would look lovely in territorial prison stripes." The threat hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Clara looked around at the ranch that had become her sanctuary, at the garden she had planted with her own hands, at the home where she had finally learned what it meant to be loved and valued. The thought of losing it all, of being driven out like criminals, made her feel sick with rage and despair. "There has to be something we can do," she said desperately. "Some legal recourse." "There is," Pemberton said with false kindness. "I'm prepared to make a generous offer for your improvements to the property. $20 for the house, $10 for the barn, and safe passage out of the territory. More than fair considering your precarious legal position." $30, Ethan said bitterly, "for 3 years of backbreaking work and everything we've built here." "Take it or leave it," Pemberton shrugged. "The offer expires at sundown tomorrow. After that, you get nothing but a ride to the territorial prison." As Pemberton and his men rode away, leaving the wedding party standing in stunned silence, Clara felt the familiar taste of defeat in her mouth. Once again, the powerful had crushed, the powerless had used money and influence to steal what couldn't be bought. Once again, she was being driven from the only place she had ever felt at home. "There has to be something we can do," Dr. Harrison said quietly. "Some legal avenue we haven't considered." Pastor Williams shook his head grimly. "I know the territorial governor. He's not a bad man, but he's susceptible to influence from people like Judge Pemberton. If Marcus has convinced him that this is a matter of proper land development, then we're finished," Ethan said, his voice hollow with defeat. Clara looked at her new husband, saw the way his shoulders had slumped with the weight of losing everything he had worked for, and felt something fierce and unbreakable rise up in her chest. She had been driven from her place in the world once before by the cruelty and greed of small-minded people. She would not let it happen again. "No," she said quietly, and something in her tone made everyone turn to look at her. "We're not finished. Not by a long shot." "Clara," Ethan said gently, "you don't understand. If Pemberton has corrupted the Territorial Land Office, then we go over his head." Clara interrupted, her mind racing with possibilities. "We go to the federal authorities. We make this a matter of territorial corruption and fraud, not just a property dispute." "How?" Dr. Harrison asked. "We have no proof of corruption." "Don't we?" Clara asked, turning to face the group with growing excitement. "Tom Morrison told us that Pemberton has inside information about the railroad development. That suggests corruption at the territorial level. And if documents are mysteriously disappearing from the land office, that's evidence of fraud." "But proving it would take time," Pastor Williams pointed out. "Time we don't have." "Then we buy time," Clara said firmly. "We make this too visible, too public for Pemberton to simply sweep under the rug." She turned to Margaret Harrison, who had been listening with growing understanding. "Margaret, you have connections throughout the territory? Women's organizations, church groups, social circles. What if word got out that a war widow was being driven from her new home by corrupt land dealers? What if the story of a motherless child losing her home reached the right ears?" Margaret's eyes lit up with understanding. "The territorial governor's wife is very active in charitable causes. She has particular sympathy for widows and orphans. And I have contacts at the territorial newspaper," Dr. Harrison added thoughtfully. "The editor owes me a favor. I delivered his grandson last winter." "It might work," Pastor Williams said slowly. "If we can make this a public scandal, force the territorial authorities to investigate properly." "It's our only chance," Clara said. "Unless anyone has a better idea." Ethan looked at his new wife with something approaching awe. "When did you become such a strategist?" "When I realized I had something worth fighting for," Clara replied simply. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. Dr. Harrison rode hard to the territorial capital to meet with the newspaper editor and file formal complaints with the Federal Land Office. Margaret Harrison organized her network of influential women to write letters and send telegrams to every important official they could think of. Pastor Williams composed a carefully worded account of the situation that painted Pemberton's actions in the worst possible light, while maintaining strict adherence to truth. Meanwhile, Clara and Ethan worked desperately to document everything they could about the ranch, every improvement, every investment, every piece of evidence that this was a working, productive homestead that had been built through honest labor and legitimate purchase. "Do you really think this will work?" Eliza asked as she helped Clara pack their most precious belongings, just in case their plan failed. "I don't know, sweetheart," Clara admitted. "But sometimes you have to fight, even when you're not sure you can win, because the fighting itself matters. Like when you saved me from the horse." Exactly like that. As the sun began to set on what might be their last day at Hollow Ridge, Clara stood in the garden she had planted with such hope and watched the evening light paint the mountains gold and purple. Tomorrow they might be homeless again, might be starting over with nothing but what they could carry. But they would be starting over together as a family, and that was something no amount of money or corruption could take away from them. The sound of approaching horses made her heart sink, but as she looked toward the road, she realized these were not Pemberton's men returning. The riders were moving slowly, peacefully, and as they drew closer, she began to recognize faces, neighbors and friends from throughout the valley. People she had met in town and at church, even some she had never seen before. Tom Morrison was in the lead, followed by half a dozen other ranchers who had refused Pemberton's offers. Behind them came Dr. Harrison, his face grim but determined, and beside him rode a man Clara didn't recognize wearing the uniform of a federal marshal. "Ethan," Tom called as the group approached the house. "You need to hear this." The federal marshal dismounted with the careful dignity of a man accustomed to delivering important news. He was older than Clara had expected, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much of the world's corruption. "Mr. Dyer," he said formally, "I'm Marshal Davies from the Federal Land Office. I understand you've been having some difficulties with your property deed." "That's one way to put it," Ethan replied carefully. "Well, I have some news that might interest you," the marshal continued. "It seems young Mr. Pemberton's activities have attracted federal attention. We've been investigating irregularities in territorial land deals for several months now, and your case fits a very specific pattern we've been tracking." Clara felt hope flicker in her chest like a candle flame in the wind. "What kind of pattern?" "Document tampering, bribery of territorial officials, fraudulent land claims," the marshal said grimly. "Always targeting small ranchers with valuable land, always using the same methods. We've been waiting for the right case to blow this wide open, and I believe we've found it." "You mean," Ethan started. "I mean, your deed is valid, your ownership is legal, and Marcus Pemberton is about to face federal charges for fraud and corruption," the marshal said with satisfaction. "We've already arrested 2 territorial land office clerks who confessed to taking bribes to make documents disappear. It seems young Pemberton was very careless about covering his tracks." The wave of relief that washed over Clara was so intense it nearly knocked her off her feet. Ethan caught her arm, his own face reflecting the same mixture of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. "It's over," she whispered. "It's over," the marshal confirmed. "Hollow Ridge Ranch belongs to you free and clear, and Marcus Pemberton will be spending the next several years in federal prison where his father's influence can't reach him." The celebration that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. The neighbors who had come to show their support stayed for an impromptu party that lasted well into the night. There was food and drink and music provided by old Pete Morrison's fiddle, and most importantly, there was the kind of community spirit that Clara had never experienced in her life. "You did this," Ethan said as they finally found a quiet moment together on the front porch, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate their victory. "Your idea to make it public to fight back instead of just accepting defeat. You saved our home." "We did this," Clara corrected. "All of us together. That's what families do. That's what communities do." Ethan pulled her close, and Clara leaned into his warmth, feeling safer and more content than she had ever imagined possible. Around them, the ranch settled into peaceful evening quiet, the sounds of celebration gradually giving way to the natural symphony of wind and water and growing things. "Mama Clara." Eliza's sleepy voice came from the doorway behind them. The child had been calling her Mama all day as if the marriage ceremony had made it official in her young mind. "Yes, sweetheart." "Are we really safe now? Really, truly safe?" Clara looked out over the land that was truly theirs, now at the garden that would bloom again next spring, at the future that stretched ahead of them like an open road. "Yes, my darling, we're really truly safe." As she tucked Eliza into bed that night, Clara marveled at the complete transformation of her life. A year ago, she had been a broken widow, convinced that her story was over. Now, she was a wife, a mother, a woman who had learned to fight for what she loved and had discovered her own strength in the process. "Tell me a story," Eliza requested sleepily. "What kind of story?" "A story about a lady who thought she wasn't pretty, but then found out she was wrong." Clara smiled, thinking of her own journey from shame to self-acceptance, from isolation to belonging. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a lady who had forgotten how beautiful she was. She lived all alone and believed what unkind people said about her, until one day she met a little girl and her father who saw her real beauty." As she told the story of their own beginning, Clara realized that this was just the first chapter of their new life together. There would be challenges ahead, seasons of plenty and seasons of struggle, times of joy and times of sorrow. But they would face it all together as a family, and that made all the difference. When Eliza finally drifted off to sleep, Clara made her way to the bedroom she now shared with her husband. Ethan was waiting for her by the window, looking out over their land with an expression of quiet contentment. "No regrets?" he asked softly as she joined him. Clara thought of the woman she had been trapped in shame and convinced she was unworthy of love. Then she looked at her reflection in the window glass, a woman who knew her own worth, who had found her place in the world, who was finally truly home. "No regrets," she said firmly. "None at all." As they settled into bed together on their wedding night, Clara felt a peace settle over her that went deeper than relief, deeper than happiness. She had learned that beauty wasn't about conforming to other people's expectations, but about having the courage to be exactly who you were meant to be. She had learned that love wasn't about being perfect, but about finding someone who saw your imperfections and chose to love you anyway. Most of all, she had learned that it was never too late to start over. Never too late to discover that your story was far from finished. Sometimes the ending you thought you wanted wasn't the ending you needed. Sometimes losing everything was the only way to find out what truly mattered. Outside their window, the Montana wind sang through the cottonwood trees where they had been married, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the promise of tomorrow. Clara closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that when she woke up, she would still be here in this place she had helped build with these people who had chosen to love her, not despite who she was, but because of it. She was Clara Dyer now, wife and mother and fighter, a woman who had learned that the most beautiful thing of all was simply being brave enough to believe you deserved happiness. And as sleep finally claimed her, she knew that her real story was just beginning.